Hello, people, and welcome to the People Building Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about secondary gain. If you are a therapist or a practitioner, this is going to be something that you're already vaguely familiar with. I will give you some more information about it very shortly. If you are someone who is perhaps supporting another person who has some kind of mental health challenges going on, then this may be of interest to you too, especially if you've noticed that no matter what solutions you put in that person's path, they never quite seem to get rid of their problem. Perhaps you're an employer with an employee who is taking long-term sick and you have put lots of solutions in front of them, but for some reasons those solutions never quite work out in the way that you'd anticipated. It might be that the person you're dealing with has some secondary gain associated to their problem. So I'm going to be telling you all about that today. If you would like to learn more, then just keep on watching and listening. I'm hoping my audio quality is going to be even better than usual today because I've had a little rejig. Not much. You probably can't see it. In fact, you probably can't even hear it. But I've got a little camera here, which is going to be doing some videos for our YouTube shorts and also for Instagram reels. So that's going on there. I've got the microphone a bit closer to me than usual today. I've actually sort of reset things a little bit. I'm really hoping that you get the benefit of the crow here in the background. By the way, some of these things, I know that there are people who only listen to the podcast. You are listening via iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, or some other podcasting platform that you enjoy. Welcome to all of you. I apologise that you don't get the benefits of the visuals. And hopefully you're the ones that are really going to benefit from that extra little touch of class that has been added in to the audio this month. All right, let me talk to you today then about secondary gain and what that means. So I've got some definitions that I'm going to share with you. I will put links to relevant stuff in the description box on YouTube and in the information box if you are listening on some podcasting platform out there, because there's going to be a few things that I kind of dip into the research and the literature to make sure that I'm giving you the proper facts on all of this stuff. But I've also got some really good definitions here that I wanted to share with you too. So let me tell you firstly, there is something called primary gain, which would make sense. We're here to talk about secondary gain, but primary gain is also a thing. So primary gain is I guess like the effects, the symptoms of your problem in its raw form. Secondary gain is the bit after that. Let me explain using a Wikipedia definition. This is a nice straightforward one. So primary and secondary gain, and more rarely tertiary gain, are terms used in medicine to describe the significant subconscious psychological motivators patients may have when presenting with symptoms. So let me just make a point here of saying these are subconscious psychological symptoms. We're going to be coming back to that later. It's important to note that if these motivators are recognized by the patient, and especially if symptoms are fabricated or exaggerated for personal gain, then this is instead considered malingering. And malingering is a term that you hear a lot within psychology, and it is an awful lot like secondary gain, but quite often people are aware, they are more conscious if they have a malingering disorder. So that means that they know that they are gaining, that they have benefits from having or acting as if they have a particular problem. With secondary gain, it's unconscious. The patient is not aware that their problem has some other benefits that they reap from maintaining and keeping the problem. All right, so the difference between primary and secondary gain is that with primary gain, the reason a person may not be able to go to work is because they are injured or ill. All right, so that is primary gain. Unfortunately, the person cannot go to work, boo-hoo, because they are injured or ill. So actually, you could sort of look at that and go, oh, they're kind of gaining something because they don't have to go to work. That would be primary gain. Whereas with secondary gain, the reason that a person is injured or ill is so that they cannot go to work. All right, so I thought that was just a really nice, sweet definition of the difference between these. Basically, the person is almost, it appears that they are deliberately using their illness or their injury to avoid work. Now, as we said, it is unconscious, so it's not deliberate, but to the outside observer, it may certainly appear that this is something they are doing on purpose. So another reference that I wanted to share with you, this has come from ResearchGate, is around how aware people might actually be of secondary gain. And I know I've just put a lot of emphasis on the fact that this is unconscious. However, to look at the flip side of the coin, let me share this particular piece of research with you too. A high proportion, 42.4% of outpatients attending a psychiatric hospital appear to harbour expectations of secondary gain and hide this from their psychiatrists. A study investigated whether the prevalence of expectations of secondary gain could be replicated in a different sample, namely a general hospital outpatient clinic attended by patients with less severe mental disorders, and whether patients hid these expectations from the psychiatrists that they consulted. The study was performed in a Dutch psychiatric outpatient department of a general hospital. In a prospective cohort, expectation of secondary gain was assessed by directly asking the patients via questionnaires whether they expected gaining specific benefits from being in therapy. All right, so this isn't a covert questionnaire. This isn't something that's, we're sort of secretly trying to find out what people are really thinking in the depths of their subconscious. This was a very blatant, upfront, direct questionnaire that basically said, are you expecting some other benefits from being here, having your psychiatric treatment? All right, so here are the results. Of 99 patients, 41.4% expected secondary gain while being in therapy. In contrast, only 9.5% told their diagnosing psychiatrist of these expectations. The present finding of a large proportion of patients expecting secondary gain is consistent with results of an earlier study. Again, in most cases, the diagnosing psychiatrists are unaware of their patients' expectations. Thus, many patients have hidden expectations of what therapy will do for them in terms of material or non-material benefits other than getting better. Earlier empirical studies have shown that harboring expectations of benefits other than therapeutic benefits may be detrimental to therapeutic success. Now, here's why I find all of that particularly interesting. I think it's super interesting that actually, when it comes to secondary gain, with the evidence from this study, it appears that the patients aren't quite as unconscious about their secondary gain. They quite blatantly know that they want some added bonuses as a result of attending their therapy. In addition, the secondary gain they're looking for might be material or non-material. I would be so interested to know, what were they hoping to get? Because it may or may not relate to their anything to do with their mental health or their therapeutic outcomes. I also find it particularly interesting that the people they are working with, their psychiatrists, aren't made aware. In most cases, it was only 9.5% who told their diagnosing psychiatrist, by the way, I'm also expecting you to make this magic happen for me in life. The rest of them didn't actually mention what these additional expectations were, which is quite terrifying for me as a practitioner and therapist, because how do you know what you are supposed to do to help someone if they don't tell you? And if they even quite proactively keep it secret from you, but they have all of these sort of added extras that they're looking to get from their sessions. So that's kind of interesting. And then we also have the fact that these hidden expectations that they have might actually be detrimental to the therapeutic success. And my guess would be that that's because as you go through the process of working with someone therapeutically, you're both evaluating, are we there yet? So there is a model that we teach in NLP called the Tote Model, which stands for test, operate, test, and exit. And it actually comes from the world of computing, I think, originally, as lots of things within NLP do. And the way that I describe the Tote Model to people is that you constantly have a tote running in your mind when you are looking to gain an outcome from something. And it's a bit like an internal sat nav. When you set up your sat nav because you want to get to a particular destination, your sat nav is constantly asking the question, are we there yet? With every turn and every extra mile that you drive down the road, your sat nav is saying, are we there yet? And if you're not, then it continues the process of operating, so it keeps giving you more directions. When you eventually reach your destination, that's when you exit from the strategy, or your sat-nav exits from giving you the instructions, because you are in fact there. So when we're running therapeutic sessions with people, both the practitioner and the client have a bit of an internal tote running. The client is checking in with themselves, thinking, do I feel better, or am I seeing the results that I want to see? Am I there yet? And the practitioner too is observing the client and thinking about the strategies that they're perhaps teaching them or sharing with them, and wondering where the client wants to get to, and making sure that the strategies that they propose are helping to move them in the direction of that eventual goal or destination that they want to get to. So what we have here with these reports around secondary gain, and how this secondary gain is perhaps not always known to the practitioner, means that in these instances, the practitioner might not necessarily have a clear idea of the destination that the client wants to get to. And that the client wants to get to one place, but the practitioner has heard something else. And they will have heard something else because the client maybe hasn't been fully transparent in describing all of the expectations that they have and the outcomes that they want to achieve. And I think it's going to be really important for those of us that are practitioners and therapists here to almost do a bit of a double take here and a revisit after we've maybe had a consultation session, or before we get to a stage of launching into the sessions that we're delivering, to make sure that we are very, very clear on the outcomes that the client wants, and that we are very, very clear on what we can and cannot provide for them. Let me give you some additional details around why it is that secondary gain is so difficult to work with, both in terms of being a practitioner and therapist, but also just in your day-to-day life. If you have someone, as I mentioned at the start of the show, who comes to you with a recurring problem, and you continually put suggestions in their path that never seem to work out for them for some reason, and you start to wonder, do they deliberately have this problem? If you've ever had that thought, the chances are there is at least the question mark of, is there some secondary gain going on here? But there are reasons why it's very difficult to prove that secondary gain actually exists. I'm going to give you some ways in which you can at least start to run the idea through your own mind and start to see if any of these boxes are ticked, which might lead you to conclude that there is some secondary gain at play here. First of all, we have to start thinking of this purely and completely from, I'm going to say, the client's perspective. They may not actually be your client. It might be that they are, as we said, a friend, a colleague, an employee, or so on. But I'm going to give you some checkpoints for you to use as you think about them and their situation and their problem. This isn't going to give you a diagnosis, so please don't think that in any way this is a formal way of identifying secondary gain, but it's just to see if maybe a yes to one or more of these is going to start leading you to think more conclusively that there is secondary gain at play in that situation. So the first thing is, does this problem that the person has, we'll call them the client, so does this problem that the client has help them to feel more in control? Okay, so does having the problem appear to help them feel or act more in control than they perhaps would do otherwise? Does having this problem in some way help them to gain attention or to feel protected? Okay, so does having this problem perhaps protect them from doing something that otherwise they wouldn't really want to do? Or does having this problem perhaps give them extra love, connection, attention, all of those sorts of things? If the answer to either of those is yes, I would start wondering if secondary gain is at play here. The other one to think about is avoidance. Does having this problem help them to avoid something else? So for those practitioners that work within my team, either NLP for Kids or under the People Building umbrella, we've got some very specific questions that we ask to help weed out any secondary gain from the upshot. And they, I would say, probably only point us in the right direction maybe 25% of the time. These questions actually give you a quite legitimate, useful answer. Very often people will say what they think you want to hear rather than what's really going on under the surface. But sometimes people slip up and they reveal things that they hadn't meant to, and that can be useful for us to know if we're identifying secondary gain. I personally think we're probably dealing with secondary gain a lot more than we often are, but it's a very slippery fish to identify with absolute certainty. So sometimes you kind of have a feeling that it's there, but you don't entirely know what the gain is going to be. So here's a few questions that you can ask that might sometimes help you to identify some secondary gain. So we ask, what is it that you're currently not doing because of this problem? Then we go on to say, what is this problem preventing you from doing, which when it disappears, you'll have to do? And then we say, what is it that you're currently doing that when this problem disappears, you won't be able to do anymore? So these are all useful questions for hopefully some of the time giving us some indication that there might be some secondary gain at play. Because whilst we've got perhaps people gaining extra attention or feeling protected by their problem in some way, sometimes the problem is helping them to avoid something that actually they don't really want to do. Sometimes the problem is giving them something that they do not want to lose, and that something might be along the lines of additional status, or maybe even some quite formative part of their identity or their personality. You know, maybe this elevates them in the eyes of others in some way by having this problem. If we swoop in there and help them to solve that problem, who do they become now? So these are some reasons why secondary gain can be really difficult for people to let go of, even if they don't want the primary problem that they have come to see you for help with. But what I want to do now is to think about ways in which we can help to identify secondary gain if it's there. We've got those questions that I shared with you from our consultation sessions. Those are useful. Definitely think about how you may be able to use them in your interactions with people. In addition, there are the 6 human needs, which are not traditional NLP structures, but they come from the work of Tony Robbins. It's not Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We're talking about emotional needs here. There are 6 of them that very often, if we look at a problem, we can chunk it up, and by that I mean look at it more broadly, almost kind of taking a step back, leaning away from it and saying, all right, overall, what is that thing doing for someone? And those needs are typically positive, but we don't always go about meeting them in very positive ways. So our reasons behind having all of these different problems that we might experience are probably good reasons, but sometimes the way in which we get those needs met might actually end up being quite harmful for us. So the 6 human needs are as follows. We have certainty, uncertainty, significance, love and connection, growth, and contribution. Now, with growth and contribution, those typically only have positive ways of being met. So typically people don't do negative things in order to meet their needs of growth and contribution. But I wouldn't say that that's 100% true 100% of the time. Certainly with the other 4, we may have both positive things that we do and negative things that we do that help to meet those emotional needs. And so what we can do is almost look at those needs as a bit more of a kind of broad spectrum label that we can apply to what we see happening, the results that someone is achieving as a result of keeping their problem. So let's take that example that we started out with, that we got from Wikipedia right at the very beginning there, where it talked about someone who is ill and as a result missing out on work. And in that particular instance, they were almost staying ill so that they didn't have to go to work. Now, we've still got this debate perhaps around whether they're doing that consciously or unconsciously. On the most part, the literature that I've read seems to imply that secondary gain is always unconscious, that the client isn't aware that they're doing it. If they are, then it's classified as malingering because they're doing it on purpose. However, the Dutch study that we looked at the very start there appeared to suggest that people are aware of what their secondary gain is. They just maybe don't tell you about it unless you ask the right questions. And even when you have asked them the right questions, they're still maybe not going to tell the right person. They are inclined to tell someone who is doing a study, but not necessarily the person who is helping them. So they're certainly not being upfront about it. Now, that's not to say that they are being consciously sneaky, but that they are maybe just not giving adequate importance to how open they need to be about what their expectations of success and outcomes are. Anyway, let's put that to one side. We're focusing now on the 6 human needs. So if we take our example of the person who continues to be ill so that they do not have to go to work, then running that through our 6 human needs, let's see which ones might be getting met there. So we said with growth and contribution, those normally have positive ways of being met. And I think in this instance, there probably isn't, on the face of it, there's not really any contribution that comes from skipping work and being ill. And there's no growth really in that either, unless the person is staying home because they're studying something else. But let's assume that that's not the case. So moving on to the others, does it meet the need for significance? Well, it might do. There is certainly a strong possibility that someone who continues to be unwell and can't go to work feels quite significant because of that. That in some ways it makes them feel as if they are different, a bit special, they get extra attention for it. Maybe they continually have people asking them how they are. Do you think you'll be able to come back? we really miss you, and all of those sorts of things. So I would say significant is definitely a front runner for having that box ticked. All right, so next we have certainty. So, is someone who is missing work because they are ill, does it give them a sense of certainty? It might do. It would, I think, be a little bit dependent on the circumstances, because maybe for them, staying at home feels more comfortable, and it's like all of their needs around them are being met. So their physical needs in this instance are being met. They don't have to try too hard. They're not being put under any pressure. So they've just got this nice little comfortable bubble that they're living in. And that would definitely fulfill the need for certainty. Certainty is often also referred to as comfort, because you know what you're getting. And so you can just chill out and relax that little bit more. So on the flip side, we have uncertainty. And it's not unusual for a problem to fulfill the needs of both certainty and uncertainty almost simultaneously, or certainly to flip-flop between the two, giving that client quite a roller coaster experience in their life. Meaning that there's lots of ups and lots of downs, and life feels quite chaotic for them. So could not going into work because they feel unwell meet the need for uncertainty? Possibly, at some points. So if, for example, they didn't know if they might lose their job over it, that's going to create a sense of uncertainty. Or maybe in the very beginning, where it almost feels like they're bunking off a little bit, then that's a sense of excitement, which also feeds into uncertainty. So uncertainty and variety or excitement are quite close to each other. So it certainly could be feeding into that one there. Could they have both certainty and uncertainty happening almost simultaneously? I think they could. It's going to come down to the specifics of their particular situation. So we've had growth, we've had connection, which we didn't think were quite being met. Significance, I would say almost definitely. Certainty and uncertainty could be either or both. And then finally, we have love and connection. So is skipping work going to be meeting somebody's needs for love and connection? Well, maybe. Again, it may depend a little bit on their specific circumstances, but if they are, getting text messages saying, I hope you feel better soon, and they're getting that extra attention that we talked about already, then maybe there is some love and connection that's coming through for them as a result of continuing to be ill. Could it be that they could still meet that need for love and connection by going back to work and socialising with the people at work? Absolutely. But maybe that doesn't fulfill the connection in the way that they most enjoy. If they prefer that connection coming from a place of them being significant in some way, and that significance is really easily met by being unwell, then it's understandable how they might even become addicted to pursuing that kind of behaviour repeatedly. So finally, what are we going to do about it? Because remember, the client may not know that they have this problem. We may not have a definite diagnosis of there being a secondary gain situation here. It may just be a suspicion. And even if we're in the position of being able to talk quite freely with the client about this, it may well be the case that their expectations of an outcome are quite different to what we think they are, and to what we are actually able to provide for them. So there's quite a lot of complications and complexities involved in this, but there are still some things that we can do to help move our client, our friend, our employee onto a better track with things. All right, so the very first thing that we can do to help get people on the right track is a bit of good old-fashioned reverse psychology. Sometimes what we find is that someone is doing the opposite to solving their problem, and by pushing them toward doing what they need to do, it almost feels as if they are deliberately repelling and going in the opposite direction. So push them in the opposite direction and see how they like those lemons. The chances are that when you start suggesting that they do the things that are going to make the problem worse, they'll think you crazy and they'll actually start to do the opposite to that. So it's a little bit of a risky strategy to use, but it is definitely a strategy that you might want to test out and employ, depending on the severity of the actual problem itself. Make sure you keep their overall health and well-being in mind before you go pursuing a tactic like that. The next thing that you can do is to talk about their secondary gain as if it is a problem that you've seen in somebody else. So rather than having them take full responsibility for the secondary gain that they are getting, and having them acknowledge and own up to that, which actually they might not be up for doing, what you can do instead is to use someone else as an example. Or to come up almost with a metaphor of that same problem or something very similar to it, because they might be able to identify someone else doing that more easily than they can identify in themselves. And so if they are not yet at the point of being conscious of their secondary gain, having them identify secondary gain in others might then be a way for you to sidestep and say, do you think that that's in any way similar to your circumstances and what's happening for you? And having them identify the problem from that perspective instead. And finally, for those of you who are working as therapists and practitioners, and maybe even in a position of authority such as employing others, one of the things that you can do is suggest that they get to keep some of their problem. By keeping some of the problem, it gives them an opportunity to still be in the driver's seat, to still be the one that is actively deciding their own fate or not. And sometimes it's easier to let go of a problem if you just let go of it one little bit at a time. Because sometimes it's the change that's difficult, not the problem. Actually, getting rid of problems is a pretty easy thing to do, but it's the uncertainty of not knowing what life's going to be like once the problem is gone. Or, if that thing had been a crutch for you in some way, how will you cope without your crutch being there? Or if that problem had met some of those needs that we've talked about, how will it be to not have that significance or that attention anymore? It's not getting rid of the problem that's the issue. It's actually going through the change process and dealing with the ramifications of that change having taken part that people find most difficult. A very, very long time ago, I worked with a lady who was well into her 80s and wanted to give up smoking. And her lungs were already pretty knackered. And if I'm being perfectly honest, there was a little bit of my brain that thought, you may as well just keep on smoking, because things were in quite a bad situation. She was already on an oxygen mask and those sorts of things. And when she came to see me, she became very, very upset at the idea of stopping smoking. And I asked her what was causing her to be so upset. And she said, because for all of these years, the cigarettes have been my friends. They've been my best friends. They've been there when I needed them most. When something went wrong in life, they were always there for me. And she went on, and I'm sure I've told this story before on a previous podcast, but she went on to tell me about when she was in the Wrens during the war, and actually cigarettes were part of their care packages that they were given to help them stay healthy in life, which is just insane. But for her, it was the idea of not having a cigarette anymore. It wasn't the process of lighting up a fag and taking a drag on it. That's not the bit that she was worried about missing. It was the emotional crutch that these things provided for her. She referred to them as her best friends. that were there when she was in a difficult situation. They were the ones that were her crutch. And so it wasn't the process of not having cigarettes that was going to be a problem for her. It was knowing that she was changing her life in some way. It was the change that was most scary. And that happens a lot for people, where actually getting rid of the thing that they don't want isn't that big of a deal. It's what they're left with afterwards. So sometimes we need to compromise with the people that we're working with and start thinking about what are the parts of the problem that you're happy to keep. Maybe not forever, but almost as a negotiation tactic to get things starting to move in the right direction and to get them loosening their grip on that problem and all of the secondary gain that it brings with it, so that they can start to prove to themselves during that time, actually, with any luck, they're stronger than they had thought that they may have been. They're stronger than they expected to be. And they can spend some time gradually losing their grip on it, realizing that they have got what it takes to be able to cope without the problem being there anymore. And then we can start to further negotiate and compromise on getting rid of that problem completely and all of the secondary gain that it used to bring for them. So hopefully you've got some really good things to work with there when it comes to identifying secondary gain, making sure that you are aware of what the gains are that the secondary gain is bringing. We've got some tactics there for being able to move past it, let it go, and some strategies to be able to support someone in getting rid of their problem and the secondary gain that it might be bringing for them. So if you found that stuff useful and interesting today, then make sure that you go ahead and hit the thumbs up button if you are watching on YouTube. Subscribe if you haven't subscribed already, but you must also click the notifications bell because YouTube's weird these days and otherwise it won't notify you when I upload the next video. And if you want to be notified, then you have to click the bell as well. If you are listening in a podcasting platform, go ahead and give this one a 5-star review. It really helps because there's loads of other psychology-based podcasts out there, and if you think this is going to be a good one for other people to listen to as well, then they need to know that this one is worth listening to because of the 5 stars that you gave it. You can also subscribe on any of the major podcasting platforms if you like to listen to the audio stuff whilst you're out there doing bits and bobs in the world. But for now, I will say thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I will see you all and speak to you all again in my next video and podcast. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.